And hello, everybody out there. We are now live. No, is it? Are we live? Wait a sec. It seems to be buffering. Let's see. Yeah, we are live. This is David Rovics with another episode of Fifth Estate Live, which comes to you every Tuesday at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern Time. And it is a sort of a project of Fifth Estate Magazine, which you can find out more about by going to fifthestate.org. It's produced by Peter Werby, a longtime member of the editorial collective at Fifth Estate Magazine, which is a quarterly print publication that you can subscribe to, and also has wonderful art as well as articles in it, and by folks like, well, myself, as well as all of the guests that we have on this particular show every Tuesday. And today we're talking with Norman Nawrocki, who is a playwright, author, musician, cabaret artist, college professor, and who knows what else from Montreal, Canada these days. Are you still a college professor? Are you teaching at Concordia these days?
Part-time. I teach how to use the arts for community organizing and radical social change.
And you're doing that over online now during the pandemic? Has that transitioned?
Yeah. This was the first year we did an online class, and I had students from all over Africa, from England, from Western Canada, and it was a very fascinating class, but it worked. I was afraid it wouldn't work, but we actually made the students and I made it work, so that was good.
Have other aspects of your life transitioned as smoothly into the pandemic Zoom era? Because I was just, there's a wonderful new book out called Death of the Artist, which I keep on mentioning on various formats. And one of the statistics the author mentions, at least in the United States currently, is that 65% of artists are fully unemployed and 95% of artists have lost income during the pandemic.
Oh yeah. I can't tour live shows anymore. I haven't done that since the pandemic. I used to give workshops across the country and cabaret shows, theater shows, music shows, poetry shows. All that's been scrapped. So instead, that's been scrapped. So instead, it's doing work online, doing shows online. I've only done 2 so far. The third one is coming up, but it's not the same. I mean, you don't have the audience in front of you. You're not able to interact. You don't meet the wonderful people. You don't taste the wonderful food. The income is not there anymore. So it's been very difficult. It's been hurtful in many ways, but I'm not giving up because I know the pandemic will end and we'll get back on the road again, back touring. And so this is a chance for me, like others, I guess, to come up with new work and prepare new work, which will be ready to take on the road later. So now I have a backlog of new shows to take on the road. So
great. So you've been finding the time to just as a time to do a lot of work, a lot of writing, and not to get lost in isolation and depression and lack of. I mean, it's all over the map. I'm not meaning to laugh at anybody suffering, but it's just you laugh or cry, but it's all over the map. And I know so many people who have, actually completely lost their minds. I mean, really are in horrible shape. And other people who have just managed to use the time really productively and are basically having a good time being hermits. It's all over the map.
It's all we can do. At the same time, trying to maintain contact with friends and colleagues, online through Zoom chats and things. That, again, it's not the same, but I've got to look at the end. I got to look at the light at the end of this long, particularly long, dark tunnel, and I got to think in terms of, okay, the work I'm doing now will be shared. I'll be able to get back on the road, a year from now, whenever. But it hasn't been easy. Certainly here in Montreal, a lot of venues are shut down. A lot of friends I know who gig full-time, 2, 3, 4 shows a week, let's say, as performing musicians or theater artists or technicians. Their lives have changed radically. Thankfully, in Canada, unlike the States, we have a support program from the federal government, which provides money for people who are unemployed, and especially now independent artists. There's a special program. You
Mm,
apply for special grants. So I've been applying for all kinds of grants and getting some support. But it's not going to, cover all the bills. So people are struggling here.
yeah.
Yeah, as elsewhere. One of the wonderful things in Montreal, probably, which has happened in Portland as well, though, was at the start of the pandemic, an incredible solidarity network sprung up, mutual aid groups all over the city. People didn't know each other at all. Just, oh, can I do this for you? Can I help you with this? Can I help you with that? And this huge network, which is not quite there now anymore, but was there to begin with, was unbelievably encouraging, and it was
Yeah.
totally grassroots.
Mm. Norman, what have you been writing about lately? Has there been the Eastern Europe focus, as with
Yeah,
a bunch of your work?
beside me, yeah, the most recent. I have a new project. I have a new project which is about internment camps in Canada that the government set up in 1914, just as they were about to enter World War One, as Britain declared war against Germany and Austro-Hungarian Empire. Canada, as a colony of Britain, joined in. And when they did, they decided to set up these internment camps all across the country, which were aimed primarily at Ukrainian Canadians who were unemployed, destitute, wandering the streets because there was massive unemployment at that time as well. And they said, let's round up these guys, put them in work camps, and make them work for free. And that's what they did. They
And
rounded.
why Ukrainians? Was the justification that Ukraine was on the side of Germany in the war? What was the
No,
justification?
Ukraine didn't exist at that point. Ukraine was occupied by Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire issued papers to people who traveled under Austro-Hungarian authorization. So their passports read, citizen of Austria, of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, even though they were Ukrainian. So when they came to Canada, and they would describe themselves to customs immigration people, well, we're Ukrainian, even though it says this, but they're an occupying power, but, oh, you're Austro-Hungarian, okay. So the Canadian government decided they're all enemy aliens, they're Austro-Hungarians, and they knew they weren't, but they just used that as a pretext because the real reason was social unrest. All these
Would that have also included arresting Poles and Austrians as well?
they picked up Germans, and they were considered first-class prisoners and given better treatment. And the Austro-Hungarians, anybody who was part of the Ottoman Turk Empire, Serb, Croatian, Romanian, a couple of Polacks, they arrested them as well, threw them in 24 camps across the country, made them build the national parks. All the national parks in Canada were built through slave labor. They were shot. They tried to escape. They were beaten. They were tortured. They were put in solitary confinement. And they were kept in these prisons for years, deprived of their rights, and then eventually released. Anyway, so I'm doing.
It's just such a hidden history, huh? And then it was, and only 10 years later, Canada was interning people for the crime of being of Italian descent.
Yeah, yeah. And then all the unemployed were rounded up as well, during the Depression and put in labor camps as well. So, but this was the first time the War Measures Act was used to round people up. And they were civilians, but they were considered prisoners of war. Unbelievable situation. The only place in the whole world where civilians were considered prisoners of war, even though they weren't enemy aliens. They weren't at war with Canada. They were loyal citizens. They wanted to join the army to fight for Canada. And yet they were imprisoned, beaten.
Their crime was their national background. And then you've been writing about, you wrote a play about the Winnipeg general strike, and so much of the goings on around that involved these xenophobic accusations, and as it turned out, so much of the strike leadership were many Canadians who had been in Canada for many generations and were of English or Scottish background, but of course also Eastern and Southern Europeans. But there was on both sides sides of the border. This extreme anti sort of Eastern or Southern European and bias and all kinds of laws passed, but in the U.S. as well. But the internment. That was a particular phenomenon of Canada. Huh? I mean, in of course, there's the history of interning the Japanese in Americans in the U.S. and of course interning Native Americans on both sides of the border. But this phenomenon of interning Eastern Europeans and interning Italians is a particularly Canadian thing, huh?
We live in Canada.
Oh, Canada.
Walks around with his heart like this, you know. And the bizarre thing, the sad, bizarre thing is this was 1914, this is 2020, and there's still concentration camps, internment camps for refugees. There's still, you know, people being rounded up, you know, deprived of their rights. And again, they're immigrants, they're refugees, they're not white English Canadians, you know. Anyway, so yeah, so history keeps repeating itself, and we still haven't learned those lessons. And that War Measures Act, 1914, was used again and again, and especially here in Quebec, in Montreal, during the 1970s, the FLQ crisis, when the urban guerrilla organization, the Front de Libération pour Québec, the Quebec Liberation Front, kidnapped diplomats and Canadian politicians, and the government introduced the War Measures Act, you know, on the pretext that this was an act of insurrection and they had to suppress this like nationwide rebellion that was about to erupt. And it's like, fuck you, you know. It's a couple of guys who'd been infiltrated by the secret police, kidnapped somebody and threw them in a car and kept them for a while and eventually killed somebody, blew up some mailboxes. But all that, in the eyes of the government, was enough reason to introduce the War Measures Act and round up hundreds and hundreds of people. Oh yeah, history itself. You know, it's fascinating doing the research because it's also family research, because I'm discovering that I actually had distant relatives who were in the internment camps, and I didn't know this. Somebody sent me an email after they saw my last play online and said, by the way, I was doing a research for my project and I saw your family name come up on a list of internees in one of the concentration camps. And I'm like, what? So you know, so all this is interconnected. All this family research, you know, is part of the creative work I'm doing now in terms of the political writing, the history. And it's interesting for me discovering my roots. But you're Polish background too, aren't you?
Yeah, Austria-Hungary. I mean, my great grandfather Adolf was a Hungarian Jew, and but he was his passport said Austria. You know, just like the folks you're talking about. And if he were in Canada, he probably would have been interned, but he was in New York.
Oh, so it's not so Hungarian more than Austro-Hungarian.
Yeah, Hungarian. Yeah, he was a Hungarian speaker with a last name that seems more probably Slavic, like from somewhere around Yugoslavia, probably. Like that's what people say. Like it sounds like kind of Croatian, maybe. But he was his first language was Hungarian in any case.
Oh, well, there you go.
And other side of the family's from Minsk, and there's my that's also another fascinating hotbed of activity that's very
Wow.
relevant to some of the writing and I mean because I don't know how to necessarily skip a century here, but I mean it's in terms of the research and the writing that you've been doing, but it's both the stuff around 100 years ago and what was going on in Canada with internment and with the strikes and the uprisings and the war. But then, the work you've also done around more recent events and the whole, I mean, it's, trying to get my head around, and I'm sure it's been a struggle for you and for lots of other people that to get our heads around the fact that, like, growing up in North America, if you're kind of familiar with your family roots and your family roots are from Eastern Europe, then quite likely there's a lot of radicals in the family, and some nationalities more than others. And as I find out historically, it's often because of refugees and who were the refugees refugees and who fled and who didn't, and who lost the civil war in Finland and who won. And there's a reason why there's so many radical Finns, especially all over North America, because of it. But this fact of all these radicals from Eastern Europe and who came to North America and were so much a part of the history of the period, and then what happened in Eastern Europe itself over the course of the past century. And like, as you write about in your travels in Poland, capitalism is a very popular thing among a lot of folks there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, things have gotten worse since I was last in Poland.
Yeah, they have. Now they're banning abortion. And that's also something you've also done a lot of work around.
Now, like, it's sad, and I'm so ashamed, given I have Polish roots. I'm a puke. I'm a Polish Ukrainian. I've got roots in both areas, but it's sad to say that now a third of the towns and cities in Poland have passed a law establishing an LGBTQ free zone and are proudly declaring themselves LGBTQ free zones. And it's open season on anybody, who's in the street, anybody who disagrees. And, the church is behind this. The ruling party of Poland, the Justice and Law Party, is behind this. The neo-Nazis, the racists, the fascists, you name it, the ultra-right that is in power in Poland is behind this. And they've been targeting as well anarchists, Jewish people, anybody of color, but particularly the LGBTQ community. That's the big target. And
this is also involved, this is giving the far right really free rein to attack people physically. And there's been a lot of physical assaults also against anarchists
as well. Yeah, that's just it. That, it's everybody now. But to actually establish these towns, these cities, to declare themselves LGBTQ free zones, and they're saying that this is an ideology that's worse than Marxism, worse than communism, and they're making people's lives like hellish. So I have mixed feelings about wanting to go back, like to continue to do research, to visit family, to visit friends. But it's like, how do you enter a country that has declared itself, at war against people based on who they are? Like, how do you do that? Yeah. Ukraine hasn't yet passed those kinds of measures, even though there's a lot of, homophobia, transphobia, racism, incredible racism in Ukraine. And I've seen that, as much as I saw it in Poland, I saw it in Ukraine as well. And it equally saddens me. But historically, the Poles have been the oppressors of Ukraine. The Poles were the masters of Ukrainians like centuries ago. They were the ones who ruled the land. They were the ones who drove the peasants, out, who gave them a good reason to emigrate to North America. And the Canadian government actively recruited them, and more so than the United States. So what's going on over there today is kind of is frightening, is horrible, and thankfully people are resisting.
Sometimes when I look at a map of different parts of Europe around the time in the 19th century, and you see which countries had more emigration to North America than others, it's like a political map too. It's like in Scandinavia, it's like, okay, 10% of the Danes left, 50% of the Norwegians left. I wonder which country was the colony and which was the colonized. You look at who left from England as opposed to Ireland. It's easy to see, the political map of Europe based on those numbers.
Well, Polish people also left more recently for England, and now they've fled England and they're no longer, going to England. When I was last there in Poland, everybody was looking abroad for work, because there's no work in Poland. The economy was doing so poorly. I'm not sure if things are any different today, but, like 1 out of every 3 people that I'd say that I met and I knew had gone abroad looking for work because there was nothing there in Poland for them.
And now they're leaving the countries that they've been going to because there's no work there. I mean, it seems like, and it's been another one of those fascinating moments in history to try to grapple with in terms of the effect on the psyche, not only of the people who have been emigrating from Poland to all over Europe, but also what the experience has been like for those in England and Ireland who have suddenly been uh, finding themselves with thousands of Poles in every city, working all the cheap jobs and yeah, in every shop that they walk into, and that's a very
Yeah.
disruptive experience for everybody involved.
And being beaten up in the streets because they speak Polish. Just
Mm,
like Ukrainians are beaten in the streets of Poland when they speak Ukrainian, and Roma are beaten in the streets of Ukraine when they speak their language. It's what the hell is going on? Pandemic aside, there's this political stuff we have to deal with. And yeah, the pandemic will end, but capitalism unfortunately won't. And that's one of the challenges now. Okay, this pandemic aside, we still got to deal with the main structural problem, and we still got to deal with climate chaos. And like that's not going to go away as much. The pandemic will, but this other stuff won't. So what are we going to do about it? So that's another challenge, is trying to figure out, okay, how do we shift people's attention back to the key issues here, and yeah, and stimulate public thinking on the questions that need to be answered. And
yeah. And that's what you've been doing very effectively for quite a long time in various forms, both songwriter, playwright, and other, as well as running workshops. And I wonder, can you talk about that process, like the creative resistance workshops that you've done a lot of, and what the how you would encourage people to join in on this endeavor?
well, at some point, you realize that you can't do all this alone and you need more help and more support. So why not train other people to do similar kind of work? And why not share the experience that I've gained over all the years of doing my work with others so they can continue the work? And why not share that experience with other people who have an idea of what they want to do but aren't quite sure how to approach it? So I set up these workshops, how to use the arts, all the arts, music, poetry, theater, literature, film, online media, how to use that stuff to address important social issues. And I package these workshops as creative resistance workshops. And I would give these workshops like across Canada and Europe, even in Hong Kong, and people would invite me to come, and they say, we have an issue here. The issue is, this big developer is taking over a big chunk of community land, and we need to fight them. Okay, let's sit down, let's brainstorm, let's come up with some ideas. And through like an hour, 2 or 3 hours, I get people to start thinking creatively, differently, using their imaginations and coming up with strategies to mount campaigns for direct actions, for creative direct actions, for creative resistance. And then they leave the workshop and away they go. And they put it into practice. And I've got great feedback from people later who say, oh, we did this and we picketed this and we sat in here and we blockaded this and we printed up these things and we unfurled these banners here and we did this and we did this. And it's really great. And we have more support now. So thank you. So it's gratifying to know that they learn skills and now they're able to do things. And that's the class I teach at Concordia, is basically based on those workshops I've been giving for years across the country.
And one of the, I mean, I think one of the clear sort of very successful examples of the kind of that kind of communication that you're talking about in these workshops was your very popular sort of sex show that you took all over Canada, as an anti-sexist sex show that did never build itself as anti-sexist, and yet it managed to attract large audiences for some great anti-sexist education, and I think it's just a wonderful example of great popular education actually being sort of working. And I mean, I think you mentioned in an article that it's possibly as many as 1 million people have at some point witnessed this performance, which is just, I mean, and we're talking about it. By the way, Canada has 30 million people in it. That's astounding.
It's actually 4 different shows I've done over the years. Anti-sexist, anti-homophobic, queer positive, trans positive. It started out, the first one was I Don't Understand Women. And it was a show about date rape, sexual harassment, violence against women. And the idea was, how do I reach all those guys out there who wouldn't go to a workshop or a lecture, a talk, a film about stopping violence against women? Because it's a guy problem. It's not a woman's problem. It's a hetero, guy problem. It's guys out there who are doing this stuff. And I came up with the idea of doing a show that involved a lot of humor, but not joking about the serious issues, not joking about date rape or anything like that. And that show became super popular, and every university and college in Canada I performed at, and even 24 in the States. I was at MIT, I was at Berkeley, I was at UMass, all kinds of places. And then that evolved into a second show, which was specifically about homophobia, because people came up to me after the first show and said, I really enjoyed this show, but take out the stuff about queers. We don't want to hear about queers, okay? All right.
New workshop.
A new show.
New show.
These were cabaret shows. I dress up in giant costumes, I had giant penises, giant vaginas, giant butt plugs and assholes. And I would play up to like 14 characters in the show, and it'd be a storyline, friends meeting and talking with the penis and talking with the vagina or whatever, going over issues and problems and personal relationships. So the shows would use humor and a serious message, would use the humor to get the serious message across. So people would be laughing, and then they'd be crying, then they'd be laughing, then they'd be crying. And then, anyway, that's what happened. So I reached all the people nobody else could reach. I'd reach the guys who'd come up to me after a show and go, it was a great show, man, but I don't think it was about women, really, was it? It wasn't about women, was it? I'm like, well, what do you think? I think you're trying to tell us something else. And I see the wheels in this guy.
Yeah.
I think you're trying to tell us something about us men, right? I go, well, what do you think? Yeah, I think it's about us men. I think you're trying to tell us men something. And I could just, David, when you see the wheels,
wonderful,
this is what it takes. And the guy at the end was like, you dirty bugger. Okay, I think I got the message. Thanks. I'm going to go home and think about this. It's like, yeah, this isn't Feminism 404. This isn't a grad study. And, Simone de Beauvoir Institute would offer. This is like the basics, The last time I did a show was in Newfoundland last year, Lessons from a 7-Foot Penis. And this young man came up to me and afterwards said, thank you. You broke the ice. Now us boys can talk to the girls. Us boys can talk to the girls. Okay, good. You can talk to the girls about, the things you need to talk about.
Yeah.
But that's the level out there. I look on my street. I live in the edge of the McGill ghetto. McGill University is a couple blocks away. And that's the level of thinking out there.
And that's where you need to communicate with people at, huh? I mean, that's how you can reach people, and then you're reaching people, right? I mean, there's when you're doing something like that, and you mentioned how people cry and then they laugh and they cry and that's an indication like you're reaching them. I mean, obviously, right? But it's not just subjective, like I'm creating great art here, but you're reaching people because you can see that.
Yeah, and it's like I'm not part of quote unquote the theater community. I'm not part of the poetry community. I'm on the margins of the music community, but the important, because I use everything. Like it depends on what the issue is, depends on the situation. Does this need a poem? Does this need a song? Does this need a piece of theater? Should I write a play about this, or a book, or whatever? Should this be a piece of comedy? Should I make this a little lighter so somebody will get the message? Or should I just keep this heavy and get people to cry,
How did that happen, Norman? Because other people early on decide I'm best at one form or another of art, or even just one particular instrument, and other people don't do that. But you never did that. But you're a really damn good accordion player, Norman. I mean, it's just fantastic. I love it. I mean, it's classic klezmer influenced. Yeah.
I wouldn't be happy just doing one particular form of art. Like right now, I'm into researching this new play, and a couple of weeks ago with my sister, we're working on new music, a new song. Before that, I worked with a band on another project, a dance music project. It's like it's not a disease, but it's like I have this thing. I don't know what it is. I can't just, it's an attention deficit disorder, I guess. I just can't focus on one particular approach. I need to be multidisciplinary.
Mm-hmm.
At different times in my life, I'll spend more time writing, or I'll spend more time playing, or I'll spend more time composing, or I'll spend more time just coming up with visuals, to go with this. I don't know. I mean, it's just, I can't imagine being any other way, frankly, and I can't imagine doing anything else. And I've done lots of things in my life, blue collar work, ditch digging, carpentry, you name it, but
did you go to university?
Yeah.
You did?
Yeah, it was so boring. It was so boring, David, let me tell you. I was so frustrated. I quit again and again and again. The most exciting part was the student activism and working on the Radical Student newspaper. And that was
which school?
Simon Fraser University in the West Coast. But I went.
And how did you're doing the creative resistance workshops? It kind of morphed into you ending up getting an actual sort of university job. And how did that happen? Because it doesn't happen to everybody who does workshops.
They said I had the experience. They put faith in my experience and my reputation, in the reviews I was getting for all the work I was doing. And given the particular kind of experience I have, because I've been a community organizer most of my life. And so the community, either people are community organizers or they're artists. It's rare that there's community organizers who are also artists, or activist artists. There's activist artists, but who has the community organizing experience? And I have the community organizing experience. And, that combined with all my creative work meant I had a particular profile, and they were looking for somebody with that profile to come up with a new program for this particular, department. And that's what I did. I wrote up this program about, okay, I'm going to teach this, and it's going to be focused on this. We're going to do this and this and this. And yeah, that's what we want. And the students love it, so yeah, it just happened. It just happened. I don't know how it happened. It just happened.
In addition to being an activist, a community organizer, the touring and performing was also paying the bills as well, right? I mean, that was your job, so as well, right?
Oh, no, absolutely. Yeah. No, that's how I made my living up until, last year, for sure.
Up until getting the Concordia job, or up until the pandemic?
No, the pandemic.
Pandemic, no, yeah, that's the main
thing.
Is
a very part-time.
That's part-time, right?
I teach one class once a year.
That's okay. Great, professor.
Here, that's right. Sometimes they bring me into another department. Sometimes the theater department brings me in because I teach a related course in the community. And it's called the School of Community and Public Affairs. I teach a class for community activists about how to use the arts. In the theater department, I teach a class for actors. How do you work with community groups? So, but that's just once a year. No. My bills get paid touring, performing. When I play, when I do shows, that's what pays my bills. And you apply for grants and things like that too.
Right. No, I'm going to talk about, you've been at this, I think, about as long as me, at least as a performer and touring and all that. I think we're around the same age. And can you talk about your experiences over the past 20 years in the field of being a touring performer? Because, I mean, this has been probably the most tumultuous period in the industry, such as it is, broadly speaking, as you know, the arts. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, it's gone through sort of three separate collapses as an industry, you know, and sort of rebirths in some form or another. But I mean, the music industry as a whole, and I know it's very, you know, it's not a perfect thing to generalize and call it one phenomena by any means, but globally the music industry is 20% what it was 20 years ago. And of course, whether you're a pop star or just a working touring performer, you don't sell merch anymore. And there's just been so many other things that have changed in the course of the past 20 years. It's you know, I could put chapters. I'd say Spotify starting their free tier in 2013 was completely devastating. But I wonder just how you would map out the past 20 years as in your real lived experience.
Well, there were years when we could make a living by selling cassette tapes, you know, cassette tapes that we produced ourselves or had mass produced. We would sell these at shows, and, you know, that would help pay the bills in addition to revenue from performing live shows.
And you're talking about the 90s now?
I'm talking about the 80s.
80s, yeah.
We started doing our first cassette tape release was 1986.
Great.
The first cassette, hand-colored, hand-folded pieces of paper stuffed into little plastic boxes, and you would sell these. And
did you run them off yourself? Did you make the copies yourself, or did you go to a duplicator to do them in the hundreds at a time? So they're really shitty cassette copies that you were making yourself.
First ones were totally DIY, real-time, cassette to cassette in little cassette tape decks. And we had one deck to use. And
oh, wow.
So while you know, my partner, Sylvain Cote, the guitarist extraordinaire, is monitoring the duplication, I'm cutting the paper, coloring it with, you know, with magic markers, folding the covers, you know, signing them individually. Everyone was hand colored, you know, and then stapling the little booklets, the chapbooks that went with them. But nonetheless, we made money with those things, you know, they cost X amount, we made money. Then we got into, you know, CDs, and we made money selling CDs as well. We made money through mail order. We made money by sending, you know, boxes of merchandise to, you know, stores, shipping it ourselves to shops all across Canada, the States, and Europe, you know. Mm-hmm. And then we toured, you know, live shows, we would sell merchandise and make money. So, yeah, so over that period, gradually, we were able to work full time as musicians, as artists, and know that, you know, we were struggling. We, you know, neither of us had a car or a house or anything, but that wasn't important. You know, I live in a housing co-op, nonprofit housing co-op. The rent's affordable. So did he. You know, we were able to pay our bills. We're able to survive. We're able to eat, you know, and continue being creative, which was the most important thing, having the freedom to be creative. And then, thankfully, because we live in Canada, you know, there's various levels of government support, and we could apply for grants for specific projects, for community cabarets that we would branch out into. Okay, here's our straight music show. Here's a community cabaret that's more theatrical, involving members of the community. We're working with them. We're teaching them skills, you know, and they're involved with us. And we would get grant money for that. And over time, you know, the income diversified, and we were able to make a good living and then tour Europe and get paid well in Europe and, you know, come home with money in our pockets. And again, we weren't rich, you know, but we were able to survive. And then all of a sudden, it's like
Hmm.
the rug was pulled out from under our feet.
When was that?
Well, that was late 90s, 98, 99, 2000, when things changed. And that band stopped touring, but I realized that sales were dropping and that people were no longer buying the cassettes or the CDs. Very slowly that transition started. And the live shows, it was getting harder and harder to draw people to live shows. There was a lot of competition.
At the same time, which is a fascinating overlap there, right? At the same time as you're selling less merch, it's harder to get people out to the live shows for the same phenomenon, which that being the internet, right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And but we just tried to diversify. I mean, I personally try to diversify. Okay, I teach people how to play. Okay, I'll do this. I'll do this. I'll play more weddings. I'll play more bar mitzvahs. I'll do this and this and this. And so, just trying to diversify more than ever. Okay, I'll teach these workshops. I'll teach this other workshop. I'll give private lessons here. So
Yeah.
just trying to make up the difference somehow. But
What about university gigs? Did you find that they were drying up too, along with everything else like that? Was that also a phenomenon?
budgets are being cut.
Yep.
University budgets are being cut. And when I started doing my anti-sexist, sex-positive sex comedy cabarets, that was in 93 I started. And in the early 2000s, budgets were being cut for so many different reasons. And all of a sudden, the universities were, sorry, we don't have the money. We don't have the money. We don't have the money. The issues haven't changed. There's still date rape and, violence on campuses and off and everywhere else. But there's no money to fund projects that maybe can, address these questions. So, so that funding dried up as well, slowly. So, over the 20 years, for sure, over 20 years, things changed radically.
And then over the course of, like, just say the past few years
Oh,
pre-pandemic, were you still finding it was working at least to do some touring, to tour in Europe, or was touring in Europe not really so viable anymore either?
not for the band, not for a band. Um, because touring in Canada was never like easy to do. It's just too big, and even touring in the States, it's just too much distance to cover. Too many people to feed and house and all that.
If I mean, just for the authorities or whoever makes such decisions, if in Canada it were possible to rent a car in one city and return it in a different city without a drop fee, the way you can do in New Zealand, then touring in Canada would suddenly become financially viable.
Sure.
But as it is, it's impossible because a tour in Canada has to be one way. You can't do a round trip tour in Canada.
Well,
So
No Means No used to do that. They would tour east under No Means No, and they would come back west as the Mackenzies or whatever they were called.
good idea. So that's one way to do it. Just be a different act.
So you're David going east, and you're John Bovich coming west. It's easy to do. Easy to do. Just the one thing.
I never thought of that.
Yeah. Well, so you have to adapt. That's all. I mean, and I've learned how to adapt. Thankfully, I've been flexible enough in the work I do. And thankfully, too, because I do different things. So, it's been a bit easier for me to make transitions. Okay, if I can't do this, I'll do that. I'll apply for this grant money here, that grant money there.
Are the grants around the way they were 10 years ago, or are they shrinking?
Thankfully, yes. For the moment, so far, yes. But it's still a competition, and you still don't get it every time you apply. Just you can't do that in the States, unfortunately. But here in Canada, it's still a possibility. For every 10, every 5, 6, 7 grant, 8, 9 grant applications I send out, I'll get a grant.
Mm-hmm.
Not every single time. You can't count on that.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like here's a guaranteed, minimum income for you as an artist, because we know you're not going to make ends meet otherwise. No, and you spend a lot of time working on the grant applications, and you don't necessarily get what you need.
Have
But
you explored crowdfunding, that whole
unfortunately, no, I've never done that. I mean, when I did my live stream shows, I was pleasantly surprised at the support I got. Pleasantly surprised. It's like, oh wow, this is great. And I really
especially at the beginning, at
well,
the pandemic?
only done 2 shows.
Okay, that's not much of a sample.
No, but I was pleasantly surprised both times that people actually sent money, and it's just like, wow, thank you so very, very much. Like I really appreciated that, and like people don't realize how much it means. They think, oh, it's only $10 or $15, but it all adds up and it makes a difference.
Mm-hmm.
So, for people out there, yeah, sure, support your artist if you possibly can, especially if they're your preferred activist artists, because our market is even smaller than that other market out there for those other artists. And I mean, I wish there was a way to ensure like a guaranteed livelihood for people that do this kind of work. But, unless there was a private foundation somewhere, the very wealthy old anarchists, set up a trust fund for artists, anarchist artists to, dig into, but it's not going to happen. And as an anarchist artist, it's like, I know that. And I'm like, okay, I don't expect that. I do the work I do, and I do, benefits, and I do all kinds of shows that I don't expect to be paid because it's a good cause. And these are important people. And, I'm not doing it for the money. I'm doing it for that cause. Even though I wrote a chapter in a book about how to treat musicians. This is,
Right.
you
I
know,
mean, if there were universal basic income and none of us needed to worry about money, there would still be some financial involvement with performances because touring is expensive. You can't travel, even if you're getting UBI, you still got to make money on a tour because you can't probably don't have a budget for all those plane tickets without getting paid.
and I wish sometimes that activists out there who organize events and expect people to play for free would realize, come on, a little bit of respect. You wouldn't do particular work for no money either. Sure, I do my activist work and don't expect to be paid, but other times there are expenses, and I can't afford to do this.
Yeah.
Me.
Can you talk about how you ended up in touring internationally at first? Because I mean, I've talked to a lot of artists on different interview shows where they've had a long career that's basically never involved leaving North America, and then they kind of look back and they're like, oh, I wish I had tried to, when I had the chance, kind of tried to branch out a bit. But you've done a heck of a lot of touring in you've toured all over Europe, not just. I mean, I tour a lot in certain countries, particularly where English is very commonly spoken. But you've toured in every region of Europe, which to me is really quite something in itself because you're talking about such different areas in terms of language and in terms of politics as well.
It helps that we speak French. I speak French. That's an additional language to add to the repertoire of languages. It helps I speak, Polish, a bit of Ukrainian. I have some other smatterings of Spanish, a bit of German, this and that. So that always helps. It makes a difference that it was important to us to get over there because we just wanted to have that experience, and we put the time into writing letters. This is all before the internet. We used to have to handwrite, type letters, put them in the mail them to Europe. Hey, we're this band, we do this, we'd like to come. Could you help us organize a show? And then a month later, we get a letter back. Oh, yes, I'd like to help you. Of course, sure. What do you need? Another month. Well, we would like to have this. So it took a lot of letter writing by snail mail. People maybe don't understand what that means, but
So this is the late 80s then you're talking about? This is like basically late 80s, early 90s, pre when email became popular. Yeah.
pre-fax machines, David. We had telephones, but they were crank telephones. Telephone.
Now I know you're pulling my leg. We had fax machines.
Pre-fax didn't have fax machines.
Seriously? You're talking how old are you? This is before fax machines.
Before
They had fax machines like in the 70s, didn't they? I think maybe they just weren't that common yet.
no,
Maybe.
we didn't. Our first things were airmailed. It needed the airmail sticker on the envelope to get
Oh yeah.
to get.
Right.
and it was all by letter. Anyway, all I'm
Yeah.
saying is just that it was important to us to go to Europe. It was important to us to tour. The fact that we had additional language skills meant it was no big deal. The fact that we're Canadian, used to driving long distances, is no big deal.
Yeah.
You know, the fact that we slept in squats, freezing our asses off everywhere, was no big deal, you know.
Yep.
And the fact that I had relatives, you know, over there, and we had friends over there, because Montreal is a cosmopolitan city, and we had a lot of European connections just from living in Montreal. So all that made a difference, I think, and made it easier for us. And Montreal is closer, and airfares weren't that, you know, exorbitant. So all that added up.
Yeah, it all comes together to make a overall phenomenon that's feasible when you're talking about your willingness to sleep on the cold floor of the squats. Definitely frees up a lot when you don't have to spend on hotels. Huh?
You know, yeah. I wrote about this in The Anarchist and the Devil. I don't know if you ever had a chance to read that. It's a collection of short stories I wrote about rhythm activism, the band touring in Europe. And in The Anarchist and the Devil, we keep a band journal, but, you know, we're in Paris tonight and the punks are puking all over us, and, you know, we're still playing. But that experience of touring in the back of a stinky sheep van, you know, and that's breaking down all the time, it's a horrible way to see the world, but we saw the world. You know, we saw Europe like that. We toured Canada like that. We toured the States like that. It's one way to do it.
It's in retrospect, it's a wonderful way to see the world, isn't it? I mean, every time my car broke down, which is so many occasions, you know, that's always such a memorable experience where you end up meeting people you never would have met otherwise. Pretty much like, yeah, every time.
And, you know, and it's meeting the people. That's part of the wonderful experience. That's being received in Europe, treated with such respect, that makes you want to go back again and again, because you don't receive the same kind of reception in North America when you tour necessarily. It's not to say people didn't treat us well in North America on tour, but you realize when you tour Europe, people are just so welcoming, so generous, so positive, and you don't have to fight to be paid. You don't have to fight to be fed. Here, eat some more. Here, drink. You know, it's just the generosity was overwhelming at times, and you would never leave a venue without a van full of extra drinks and food for the road. That here, take this so you won't be hungry, so you won't be thirsty, you know. And you end up with a van full of cheese and bread and everything else, and vegan delights. And it's like, wow, you know, it doesn't happen here.
Yeah, this and the time that you were doing a lot of touring in Europe was also right around the time that the wall came down, right? And so that must did you tour in Eastern Europe before the wall came down too? Can you
Yeah.
talk a bit about that experience of touring in Eastern Europe on either side of the wall coming down? I know we only have 7 minutes, so this would be good for another hour. But
You, you know, being warned again and again and again to be careful what we said, like in Poland, when the Communist Party was in power, we would do shows in venues where people said to us, now be careful what you say tonight, because the walls have ears, they have eyes, and you might not be returning. You could end up in jail tonight. So be careful, watch your tongue, you know. Okay, you know. And we learned from people there who were performing as well that you slip things in between the lines, you write about it like this, you know, you say things diagonally, you make a reference which isn't direct but oblique, and you make your political statements like this, and you can finish your show and not be picked up by the secret police and kicked out of the country or imprisoned or beaten up or whatever. Because we were warned time and time again by people there to be very, very careful. And then later, when we went back to Poland and they embraced capitalism, and we did a satirical cabaret called Welcome to Capitalism, Poland, people screamed at us, how dare you? How dare you tell us these lies about capitalism? We know capitalism is good for us. We know capitalism is better than what we had before. How dare you suggest it's otherwise? And it's like, just wait and see, you know? And sure enough, When we were there during the Communist Party in power, everybody was fed, everybody was housed, everybody had education, everybody had health care, everybody had a long life, could imagine having a long life. They didn't have access to consumer goods. You couldn't say this, you couldn't say that, you couldn't demonstrate. Okay, but they had like good, comfortable lifestyles compared to a lot of people here in North America who are living in the street, starving, no access to health care, no access to education, no access to housing. There, everybody was taken care of. And then when the regime collapsed and capitalism walked in, all of a sudden, people had no health care. People had no access to education. People had no more housing. People lost their jobs. And the pay rates were cut. And life expectancy dropped. And the list just went on and on and on. And you saw people begging in the streets, sleeping in the streets, and you never saw that before. Now, today, I went to Poland like 2 years ago. I thought I was in Montreal or Toronto. Condominiums everywhere, McDonald's, Kentucky Fried Chicken everywhere.
But you were writing that, and I think you said Krakow, this is a few years old, so it's probably worse now, but Krakow was 70% of the inner city is owned by foreign real estate investors.
It's worse now. Yeah, it's like 90% now. It's like, where's Poland gone? Where's the Poland that the Poles once knew gone? They can't afford to live there. Just like we can't afford to live in our cities because of, condominiums everywhere and, high cost of rent. Polish people can't afford to live in their cities anymore either.
This is what on the West Coast, I think from Vancouver to LA, this is what before the pandemic we just called the crisis, which is the housing crisis.
We have it here in Montreal as well, David. It attacked this city in the last couple of years. All of a sudden, rents doubled overnight. It was just like we knew it was coming. We didn't know when, and all of a sudden it hit. And
despite rent control laws there.
There's a huge homeless camp on a highway just on the edge of Montreal here, a tent city that grew up during the pandemic because people had nowhere else to go. And the so-called progressive mayor of Montreal yesterday sent in the riot squad and said, oh, this is going to be done, gently, respectfully. People can take what they need and they'll be relocated somewhere. Riot squad came. You got 20 minutes, get 2 bags and get the hell out of here. And then they burned all the tents and sleeping bags that were still good.
Wow.
Oh, no, but in Poland, you see the same thing, man. There's people sleeping in the streets there, and they weren't sleeping in the streets before. And housing is now a problem all over Poland. Access to affordable housing is becoming a worse problem, and foreign ownership has increased. Last time I was in Poland, I couldn't believe how many foreigners there were all over the place, and these were their businesses. They bought beautiful old buildings, converted them into restaurants, bars, cafes, whatever, and they're pricey, trendy tourist traps, and they're Airbnbs all over the place.
Airbnbs, yeah.
Oh yeah. Same thing's happening in Ukraine, which is even poorer than Poland. So, yeah, we got a lot of work to do. Still,
got any predictions for where that's all going in terms of at what point people reach a breaking point and what they do when they get there?
Not yet, but I know here in Montreal, there's still a lot of organizations doing a lot of incredibly good, positive work, resisting gentrification, coming up with alternatives for housing people, coming up with new projects to house people. They stopped one building from being torn down, converted into condos. It was a huge victory. And it's like, okay, we did it there. We're going to do it elsewhere. So hopefully those lessons will be learned. As I said, during the pandemic here, there was a lot of mutual aid groups that were set up. Well, in my immediate neighborhood, among those mutual aid groups was a proposal for a soup kitchen to feed all the homeless in my neighborhood, which had never happened before. And now a big project to set up a community garden run by the community to feed people in the neighborhood, which is a big step forward, a big plus. So these kinds of initiatives give me hope that, at the grassroots, people are still able to organize and able on some levels to come up with alternatives to take care of ourselves, to take care of each other, and to show them that, no, you're not going to fuck us over. We're gonna resist, and we're going to come up with this. All we need is more direct action pickaxes and shovels to turn all that asphalt out there into green space. Still to come.
Excellent plan. Norman Nawrocki, it was great talking to you. Thanks so much for spending the hour with us here.
Pleasure, David. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah. See you again.
Do zobaczenia, as we say in Polish and Ukrainian. See you later.
And thanks everybody out there for spending the hour with Norman Nawrocki there, cabaret artist, writer, musician, part-time college professor in Montreal, Quebec, and I'll be back with another interview with on my Discussions with David show tomorrow at the same time on the same platforms, whether you're watching on the Facebook page of Popular Resistance or Cable Community Radio or one of my own Facebook, Twitter, VK, LinkedIn, Twitch, YouTube pages. And it all gets turned into a podcast afterwards if you look for This Week with David Rovics wherever you get your podcasts. It's also archived in podcast form at fifthestate.org. And remember, don't pay the rent. Trust your neighbors. Mutual aid will get us through. Bye for now.